We're in the second week of July 2026, and the leaders who oversee the Western world's longest-standing military alliance just concluded 2 days in Ankara maintaining the fiction that everyone present shares identical objectives. They don't. That's the element nobody articulates publicly at a NATO gathering, and it's the element worth examining for the next half hour, because the distance between what's being declared and what's actually occurring is where the genuine narrative exists. Begin with straightforward facts, because they carry more weight than surrounding spectacle. 32 heads of state convened in Turkey this week under themes of defense investment and industrial capacity. The figure dominating discussions was 5% of GDP, 3.5% on direct military expenditure, 1.5% on supporting elements, transportation networks, port facilities, the infrastructure enabling rapid armor deployment if circumstances require. That benchmark was established last year in The Hague. This gathering was supposedly about demonstrating the alliance's seriousness, and measured purely numerically, something has changed. European members and Canada have increased defense spending by roughly $1 trillion across the past decade, with a pronounced surge just within the last 2 years. That's substantial capital and merits acknowledgement. But allocating funds and possessing capability are distinct matters, and the interval separating them is measured in years, not press releases. You can authorize procurement of a new air defense battery this week. You won't have that battery operational for 18 months, potentially longer if supply chains are congested. And presently they are, because substantial American production capacity that would ordinarily flow toward Europe has been redirected toward an entirely different conflict, the one against Iran. So European leaders stood at lecterns announcing record expenditures. American officials declared the alliance finally shouldering appropriate burdens. And beneath all of it, the actual equipment that would materially affect the situation on the ground in Ukraine this winter largely doesn't exist yet. That tension manifested immediately upon the American president's arrival. Before completing ceremonial photographs, he was informing German officials their defense budget was inadequate, while the German chancellor publicly defended it as the most substantial military expansion his country has undertaken since reunification. This isn't novel theater, it's the identical argument running since this administration's first term, except now it's unfolding against the reality of an American military simultaneously attempting to fight or threaten combat into theaters at once with a defense industrial infrastructure never designed for such dual-front demand. And here's the figure that should concern anyone paying attention more than any podium remarks. Reporting from the Pentagon this year indicates the U.S. Navy currently possesses more missile launch tubes across its fleet than it has missiles to load in them. Read that again. It's not figurative, it's an actual inventory shortfall. You can manufacture the launcher faster than you can produce what it fires, and precision munitions, the type that actually intercept ballistic missiles, the type Ukraine has been requesting all week, require specialized components, specialized workforce, and specialized timeframes that a wartime economy in 1943 could expand rapidly. But a peacetime one in 2026 simply cannot. Which brings us to the Ukrainian president, who spent this entire summit engaged in something between diplomacy and solicitation. Because at this stage in the conflict, those have merged into the same activity. He arrived making one particular focused request: more interceptors, specifically the variety capable of downing Russian ballistic missiles, because his air defense personnel have become proficient at destroying drones and cruise missiles, but keep observing ballistic warheads penetrate defenses. Days before the summit even commenced, Russian strikes on Kyiv killed over a dozen people and damaged more than 100 residential structures. That's not an abstraction. He's arguing from that's the week he's experienced. The uncomfortable reality beneath his request is that the shortage he's describing didn't occur accidentally. It occurred because the same Patriot interceptor production facilities that would normally prioritize Ukraine have had portions of their output redirected toward the Iran conflict and toward replenishing stockpiles drawn down, defending Israel and Gulf partners earlier this year. So you have two American client relationships competing for the identical limited pool of interceptors. And nobody in Washington has been willing to state publicly which takes priority, because stating it explicitly means acknowledging a choice is being made, and acknowledging a choice is being made means admitting that we support all our allies fully was never entirely accurate to begin with. The bilateral meeting between the American and Ukrainian presidents this week was presented as renewed momentum toward ending the conflict, and there's genuine substance behind that presentation. There have been actual communications described by participants on both sides as substantive between Washington and Moscow in the days preceding the summit. The American president has stated publicly multiple times that a resolution is nearer than people recognize. Whether that's accurate or whether it's the same variety of optimistic messaging offered every few months for 4 years is a legitimate question, and serious analysts studying the conflict closely aren't convinced. The Russian position has actually softened sufficiently to make genuine settlement possible right now. That skepticism deserves serious consideration rather than dismissal in either direction. Step back from Ukraine momentarily and examine where this summit was actually convened, because the location conveys its own narrative. Turkey has spent recent years doing something genuinely distinctive among NATO members, engaging every side of every conflict simultaneously and succeeding. It maintains functional relations with Moscow. Even as fellow NATO members impose sanctions, it has emerged as one of the alliance's largest arms exporters independently, and its president has cultivated a domestic and regional identity as a defender of Muslim causes publicly critical of the Gaza conflict in ways most Western European leaders have avoided while simultaneously hosting the American commander-in-chief and photographing cordially with him. This isn't hypocrisy so much as coherent strategy, and it merits serious consideration as such because it reflects something larger than one nation's foreign policy. There's a reasonable argument advanced by regional specialists, not merely partisan commentators, that in a Middle East where American and Israeli dominance is no longer the unquestioned baseline it represented for the previous 3 decades, two historic powers are positioned to occupy whatever space emerges. Turkey and Iran. Both are established civilizational states with extensive institutional memories outlasting any given government in Washington. Neither is disappearing and substantial anxiety radiating from European capitals. This week isn't really about Russia at all. It's about dual-front uncertainty where their old adversary eastward is now needed as potential partner and their newer, more assertive neighbor southward is a country they can't afford alienating but also can't quite trust. Now to the battlefield itself, because despite summit choreography, the conflict doesn't pause for conferences. Russian forces have continued advancing methodically eastward, and the pattern has shifted in a particular manner worth noting. Rather than merely contesting frontline positions, Russian strikes have increasingly targeted Ukraine's defense industrial production, its fuel infrastructure, and its supply networks, attempting to suffocate the war effort at its source rather than just at its periphery. That's a strategically different approach than earlier war years, and it's part of why the interceptor shortage matters so acutely right now. It's not merely about protecting Kyiv's apartment buildings, though that's sufficient reason independently. It's about protecting the factories enabling Ukraine to continue fighting at all. There's also a quieter development unfolding in Poland deserving more attention than it's received. Poland has been by any measure among the most committed frontline supporters of Ukraine's war effort, sending equipment, absorbing millions of refugees, and losing its own personnel in the process, a toll rarely making headlines outside Poland itself. But signs of fatigue are emerging. Polish officials have taken steps to formally distance themselves from the Ukrainian president after a period of warmer symbolic relations, and there's growing domestic political pressure regarding the cost of hosting so many displaced Ukrainians for so long. None of this means Poland is abandoning its position. It means the frontline state that was supposed to be the most reliably hawkish voice in the alliance is starting to exhibit the ordinary political strain accompanying carrying heavier burdens than anyone else for consecutive years. Contrast that with Nordic and Baltic members, where the posture has moved oppositely, further into alignment, further into risk acceptance. Finland has moved to formally accommodate larger American military presence, including infrastructure associated with nuclear-capable weapons systems, a step that would have been inconceivable in Finnish politics a decade ago, back when the country's entire post-war identity was constructed around careful neutrality with its much larger neighbor next door. Whether Finnish voters would have endorsed that shift if consulted directly is an open question. Neither Finland nor Sweden held referendums on NATO membership itself, and public opinion on hosting foreign nuclear infrastructure specifically has never been tested at the ballot box. That doesn't make the policy incorrect. It does make it worth noting as a gap between elite consensus and demonstrated public consent. There's a historical parallel here worth extracting because it's not really about Finland specifically. It's about what occurs when small states on a great power's border become symbolically important beyond their actual size. Return to the late 1870s preceding the Congress of Berlin. German newspapers overflowed with anti-Russian sentiment then, agitating for confrontation, despite Germany's own chancellor being horrified by the prospect because he understood Germany had no actual interest justifying the risk. He went so far as arranging a personal meeting between his own monarch and the Russian Tsar, specifically to prevent a conflict neither government's leadership actually wanted, and he brought his top general to stand before parliament and state essentially, "We have no need of anything Russia possesses. Let public agitation say what it wants. There's no war here worth having." And there wasn't, not until 1914, decades later, under completely different leadership and completely different pressures. The point isn't that history repeats, it's that public sentiment and elite strategic interest can diverge sharply, and the leaders who manage that gap wisely are those who avoid conflicts their countries don't actually need. Which brings the conversation to the figure at the center of this week's summit. Because whatever else you think about the current American president, the questions being raised about his decision-making process are legitimate ones, not partisan rhetoric. He is by structure of temperament and by his own public statements someone who prefers rapid visible outcomes over patient strategic sequencing. He has stated repeatedly and publicly that he wants to end the conflict in Ukraine. He has also continued authorizing and defending military action against Iran, even as that action visibly strains the very supply chains his own administration needs to fulfill Ukraine commitments. Those two commitments are in direct tension with each other, and there's no evidence yet of a clear internal determination about which actually takes priority when resources run short, which, per the figures on missile inventories, they already have. Turn to Iran itself, because the situation there is more fragile than the term ceasefire suggests. What exists presently is not peace. It's an interim memorandum roughly 60 days into a negotiating window following a conflict that opened with the assassination of Iran's supreme leader and included strikes killing well over 100 civilians at a school near a naval installation, a detail that vanishes in strategic-level summaries but shouldn't. Since then, there's been a genuine ceasefire framework signed by both governments, extended negotiations in Switzerland, a temporary reopening effort for the Strait of Hormuz, and running alongside all that, continued strikes in Lebanon and continued friction over precisely what the ceasefire does and doesn't encompass. Israeli officials have maintained pressure on Hezbollah even after the broader truce was announced. Iranian officials have accused Israel of violating the agreement's spirit, if not its letter. This is not a settled situation, it's a pause both sides are using to rearm and reposition, and multiple regional analysts have stated plainly that a return to open conflict remains a live possibility, not a remote one. There's a human dimension to this worth dwelling on rather than rushing past. Iran's supreme leader was killed at this conflict's outset, and his funeral procession drew millions of mourners into Tehran's streets. It would be a mistake to interpret that turnout as simple religious devotion or state-manufactured spectacle, and it would be an equally serious mistake to interpret it as evidence the Iranian public broadly supports its government's foreign policy. Both interpretations oversimplify something more complicated: national grief that exists somewhat independently of political approval, the way people can mourn what a conflict has done to their country without endorsing every choice their leadership made along the way. That distinction gets flattened constantly in Western commentary in both directions, either dismissed entirely or treated as proof of fanatical unity. And neither treatment does justice to what's actually a very human, very common response to witnessing your country dragged into a conflict that costs it enormously without securing corresponding gain. Meanwhile, in Gaza and the West Bank, the situation the world has largely stopped covering closely continues, generating real suffering that hasn't paused for any of this diplomacy. Settlement expansion and forced displacement have continued in the West Bank alongside periodic renewed strikes in Gaza itself, even as international attention has shifted almost entirely toward the Iran conflict and the Ukraine conflict. This isn't a minor footnote, it's the through line connecting almost everything else in this region. The reason Turkish public opinion has hardened, part of the reason Gulf states have grown wary of full alignment with Washington, and a significant component of why so much of the global South views American Middle East policy with open skepticism, regardless of which party holds the White House. Now pull the lens back further to the economic narrative running beneath all this, because it's arguably more consequential across the next decade than any single battlefield outcome. There is a visible, accelerating trend of countries, not just adversaries of the United States, but longtime partners to constructing financial infrastructure. That doesn't depend on American systems. Alternative payment networks, larger gold and strategic resource reserves, deeper trade relationships denominated in currencies other than the dollar. None of this occurred because of any single policy decision. It occurred cumulatively across years as country after country observed sanctions, deployed as a routine instrument of American foreign policy, and concluded independently that dependency on a financial system controlled by a single government was itself a strategic vulnerability worth insuring against. China's infrastructure investment across Eurasia and Africa is often described in the West purely as expansionism. It's also more mundanely precisely what a state does when it wants to ensure its supply lines can't be severed by someone else's navy, a lesson China's own history, including a century of coastal powers dictating terms from offshore, made vividly clear to its own leadership. And here's where all these threads actually converge. A country wanting to project power credibly needs three things simultaneously: sufficient military production capacity to support its commitments, sufficient financial credibility that its coercion tools still function, and a public at home that understands what's being spent and why. Right now, by available reporting, there are genuine questions about the first. There are visible signs of erosion in the second. And on the third, there's a documented persistent gap between how urgently policymakers in Washington describe the stakes of these overlapping conflicts and how much attention the American public is actually paying to any of it day to day. Domestic politics keeps circling back to prices at the pump and prices at the grocery store, understandably, because those are the signals ordinary people actually feel. Foreign policy commitments that don't appear in a weekly grocery bill tend to remain abstract until the bill comes due in some other form: a supply shock, a market shock, a benefit check that arrives smaller than expected. None of this is offered as a prediction that collapse is imminent or that any particular outcome is inevitable. Great powers absorb enormous amounts of strain before anything visibly breaks, and the United States retains advantages in alliance structure, in financial depth, in raw economic scale that no single rival currently matches independently. But the specific claim emerging from this week's summit that record spending announcements and reaffirmed unity statements represent decisive progress deserves more scrutiny than it's receiving in most coverage. Spending commitments are not capability. Capability takes years to construct and can be drawn down in months, and a strategy attempting to fully support a conflict in Eastern Europe, a fragile and possibly reigniting conflict in the Middle East, and an assertive posture in the Western Hemisphere all simultaneously without a clear and public statement of which commitment takes precedence when resources run short is not really a strategy. It's a hope that the choice never has to be made explicitly. That choice is coming either way. The only genuine question remaining is whether it gets made deliberately by people who've considered the trade-offs and are willing to explain them to the public that will bear the cost, or whether it gets made by circumstance on someone else's timeline in a moment nobody in Ankara this week chose. History tends to prefer the second option. It's cheaper for the people making the decisions and considerably more expensive for everyone else.